All right. Good afternoon, and thank you to AI at Wharton for this opportunity. So I'm going to, for the next several minutes, ask a question. Do accountability measures always ensure desired outcomes? And I'm going to answer this in the context of journalism, where of late, journalistic outputs have been automated or augmented. And in order to control that, the typical carrot and stick mechanisms don't work. Now, why do we consider this question? And it's not just because AI is getting used more and more in journalism. It's also because journalists themselves are now scared. So much so that there was a Paris AI Charter on Journalism, which has 10 principles. I'll talk about 6 of them, which are germane to this paper and to a subsequent one. The first principle talks about journalistic ethics guiding the use of technology in journalism. The second one talks about prioritizing human agency. The third one talks about due diligence of AI before it is used. The fourth and fifth talk about accountability of the content produced and transparency of when AI is used. And the sixth one talks about traceability of content when AI is used. Now, is it the case that only the big wigs like WAPO and New York Times are concerned about this? Not so. Even the local news organizations are warming up to these principles and saying, we need to do something about this. And not just the academia in business, outside academia in journalism is actually getting warmed up to this idea that there needs to be some work done on how AI impacts journalism. So, for this paper, we look at 3 of these principles and the interactions of human agency with accountability and transparency. And in short, what we do is we present a principal agent framework that looks at analyzing these interactions between human agency, accountability, and transparency, where remember, going back to the fundamental question, accountability measures are accountability in some sense and transparency. The final goal of this project is to actually show you and convince you today that there is a paradox at the heart of using AI in journalism, which we call the heliograph pinpoint paradox. For those of you who don't know, heliograph is the automation tool being used by Washington Post. Pinpoint is the tool brought out by Google for augmented journalistic content. Now, what should you take away from this room once I finish talking? 3 things. First, if you look at news organizations and journalists, our model analysis suggests oversight is paramount, and that screening journalists for their ability to use AI for augmentation doesn't really work. Second, when we consider news organizations and the public like you and me, transparency doesn't really matter. What matters is if there are 2 news organizations in the market, one of them using it for automation, other one using it for augmentation, it matters how much effort each of them is dedicating towards common journalistic tasks. Only then the person or the organization using it for augmentation gets more attention from us. And then finally, the paradox, which basically answers this question, that it is not necessarily true that if news organizations hire journalists who do augmentation rather than automation, it's not necessarily true that these organizations get more attention or readership from us. All right, let me jump into the model fundamentals here. So this is what our model looks like pictorially. So there are 2 principal agent models interlinked. In the upstream one, you have the editor as the principal and the journalist as the agent. And in the downstream one, you have the news organization as the agent and the public, which is you and me, as the principal. Now, each of these models that we analyze transforms that fundamental question in the first slide into something relevant to that context. So, for model 1, we basically ask, what role does oversight have when we are screening journalists for their ability to use AI for augmentation? Now, the relationship between editors and journalists is fraught with adverse selection and moral hazard issues. And it so happens that right now, in this environment, when it comes to adverse selection, it has been reported that in certain interviews for journalists, they're actually being told that your job is to supervise and adapt articles written by ChatGPT. And when it comes to moral hazard, this term that is getting bandied about and is getting popular is called journalism, where news organizations are being told, look, margins are short, we need to make money, churn out articles as fast as you can, don't worry about accuracy. Consequently, for our model, our agents, remember this is the model 1, our agents, journalists, are of 2 types, shirkers and non-shirkers, where shirkers are the one that devote more time towards AI use, therefore assumption being they automate, And the non-shirkers are the ones who devote more time towards traditional journalistic tasks, assumption being they augment. The principal in this case, which is the editor, only employs oversight if he suspects that the journalist is a shirker. This is what it looks like in pictures, but let me jump to Model 2. In Model 2, we have the public, which is you, me, the public as the principal and the news organization as the agent. And the question we ask here is, what role does transparency have when we screen agents for AI use? Now here, let me be careful. This is not an employment relationship. You don't employ a news organization for your news. You engage with it. So this principal agent model is more towards a relational contract rather than an actual contract. But the idea is still the same. So therefore, even in this case, there are adverse selection and moral hazard issues. But in adverse selection, actually, people have said that if it's revealed that I'm reading something written by AI, I'm not going to read it. And then finally, for moral hazard, only 8% of the 52 news organizations surveyed have said that they have any enforceability when it comes to AI use, which means there have been horrible incidents of reports getting churned out by CNET, Enterprise, Irish Times, and so forth. Consequently, in this case, also our agent, which is the news organization, is of two types, shirker and non-shirker, very similar to Model 1. But the principle here is risk averse. That is you and me. We have attention that is costly. We're going to give it if it's worth it. So therefore, if it's risk averse, the principle has something called engagement utility. The utility goes up if what I'm reading aligns with my views, and it goes down if it's revealed that AI has written it. And the idea here is the principal wants to incentivize news organizations to augment the article rather than automate it. All right, let me jump into the insights now. For Model 1, the way we do it normally in agency theoretic analysis is we look at the perfect world where there is no ambiguity. So in Model 1, the no ambiguous world basically says shirkers get paid lesser than non-shirkers, with or without oversight. And with oversight, shirkers are paid more than without oversight. But what happens when the real world rolls around? Two sorts of contracts are possible. The first, which I would say is very rare, is when the principal, which is the editor, is able to clearly distinguish between a shirker and a non-shirker, given their reported types. He can be no worse off than the perfect world, which means he can award contracts that are better off for everyone. But you might say, look, that's not the perfect world. That doesn't really work. Journalists are of similar skill sets. You can't really distinguish between a shirker and a non-shirker. And I agree with you, which means our second contracts, which are possible, basically have the non-shirker earning more and reporting their type truthfully, whereas the shirkers having no incentive to do that and getting paid less. Now, there is a problem here. And the problem is our insights are actually going against what the current industry trends are. What I mean is wage homogeneity is a big demand in the journalistic market. And that's a problem because 1 in 6 journalists are part of labor unions. So we analyze the case where we actually pay shirkers and non-shirkers equally. And there, it turns out, shirkers are overcompensated, non-shirkers are undercompensated. So what does all this mean for Model 1? It basically means that for the principal, which is the news organization editor, oversight is the dominant strategy. And we're happy that this is the result because that reflects what even the public, even the academia in journalism is saying. Now, let me put on my skeptical hat and critique my own work. Like, is that it? Is that your big idea? Certainly not the case. Because in mathematical models, you have assumptions. And when we relax those assumptions, we actually get 3 more interesting insights. First, if oversight is actually costly, then it's not always a given that oversight is the dominant strategy. What we do get is that when the shirkers can shirk costlessly, when it's easy for them to shirk, then oversight should be the dominant strategy. We then get that when agents, which is journalists, if using AI itself is a costly endeavor for them, they might not know how to use AI, they might have to learn, etc., then contracts with screening are actually impossible. And then finally, suppose we be good people and say, there are no shirker journalists. All of them are good. And shirking is just something that happens sometimes. Well then, contingent contracts are what our model says are possible. All right, what about the downstream? Simple. Again, perfect world. What happens? Very, very traditional to what principal agent models have. When principals are risk averse, they just pay as much attention as possible to make the agent indifferent between participating or not participating. So nothing new here, nothing for you to remember. But what you should take away from this analysis is that even when there is transparency or no transparency, the only condition that our model says that guarantees a non-shirker news organization gets more attention than a shirker organization is when the non-shirker news organization dedicates similar efforts towards journalistic tasks as the shirker organization. Now, if I were to give you an example, think of BuzzFeed News and NPR being similar in how they do journalism. Weird, but that's what it is. All right. Now, in this case also, is that it? Again, certainly not. And here we have the opportunity with our model to ask a very interesting question. What if transparency comes at a price? What if the news organization says, I can tell you if the AI wrote this article, why don't you subscribe to me? We then see that it is possible for there to be first best contracts, which means the principal and the agent are all better off if transparency comes at a price. Now, even here, our model is a little bit astray from what the reality is. There are conflicting evidence. Medium recently said that we will disclose AI transparency, but it will be outside a paywall. But New York Times, which is famously paywalled, has said, good, we'll ask our journalists to be more transparent, pay us money. All right, now comes the big part of our analysis, which is the heliograph pinpoint paradox. This is where we join up the two models and we ask the question, what happens in the market when both such companies are there? So let's follow along. Let's consider a heliograph scenario where news companies have something like heliograph, automating articles, and they start churning out. They do journalism, all right? And the more they do journalism, they more gain in productivity, more money. They hire more journalists. The more journalists that they hire, the likelihood that these articles align or unalign with the views of consumers like you and me is higher. What that means is now there are articles that are doing this enragement by engagement. You either get very angry reading them or you get very happy reading them. The sensationalization at the end of the day ends up putting off readers. And what do? I don't want to read this anymore. And the news organization loses readership. Case in point, BuzzFeed News, which recently closed. Now, let's come to the pinpoint scenario. In this case, a news organization says, I want to use AI to augment my articles. I want to hire journalists who do that. Great, hire them. You gain reputation in the market. You hire more such journalists. However, this hiring is happening at higher and higher costs. Because remember, augmenting is higher cost than automating. Now, if there are higher and higher costs, readers, on the other hand, are getting something that, do I really like this? Is it really talking to my views? I don't think so. So then they start saying, okay, this is getting boring for me. I better look at something that appeals to me. And then finally what happens is they lose readership. Case in point, NPR News. So with me having told you all about AI and the changing nature of journalism, what is the last thing you should take away from this talk? 3 things. First, journalism can survive AI, although that will come at the cost of some friction in the labor market, where journalists will be forced to gain skills that allow their hiring in these newsrooms that are now using AI for augmentation or automation. But journalism will survive AI. And contrary to what you might think, journalists care a whole lot more about their jobs than we think. So as long as that is true, we are good. And then finally, my parting sort of tidbits to you, you should be more angry. You should be more anxious. You should demand transparency and everything else when it comes to journalism. Because journalism is the fourth estate that holds democracy up. And as we all know, democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abhishek. We have some time for questions.
Yes.
Let's start over there.
I think very interesting talk. I wonder if you try to think about heterogeneity on the consumer side, because a lot of this assumption is basically baked into everybody wants the same thing, right? I mean, people kind of move from less reliable outlet to more reliable outlet. But if you have different types of consumers, some prefer to read daily news, some prefer New York Times, how would that change potentially the sorting? Because maybe then journalists also will start sorting in different outlets based on consumer heterogeneity as well.
That's a great point. And I can answer that question actually with some structure, because when we do the simulations for these two scenarios, because if you put principal agent models together with these issues, you can't solve it mathematically. What we see is in 100 simulations run, we inevitably, if we don't remove assumptions regarding the principles in both these cases, we inevitably end up with majority equilibria where this happens. Now, to go back to your point, yes, if we relax assumptions about the principle, choosing AI for automation augmentation, we will definitely see some other equilibrium. So yes, I completely get your point, and that's point well taken.
Good question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, do you think that there might be potentially the use of AI to completely replace traditional newspapers, at least some high-level news summarization, say Trump posted something on Twitter, X. Why do I need to read an article about it if I could do some real-time summarization on everything that was discussed by key accounts?
That is a valid point. And Pinpoint is actually the software that does that. They do annotations, summarization, transcriptions for these articles. And that's the level of augmentation they do. As long as that's there, I think it's okay. But then going one step again from there and saying that write me an article after summarizing, that gets into the heliograph world, which we don't want to be. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Time for one more question. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. I have one question on the principal agency approach to the downstream. So can you explain a bit more what your ideas are about that consumers are agents of suppliers?
No.
Because that's quite strange in terms of what you believe is happening.
So this idea, this entire framework idea is actually what we did is we joined together principal agents work that has been done in journalism literature, surprisingly, not economics. And they actually say that we can treat the public, which is you and me as the principal, contracting again, not really contracting in terms of money, but contracting in terms of engagement with the agent, which is the news organization. So we treat them as people who give us utility by giving them attention. So that's the idea over here. Now, what is crucial here to understand is that the agent here has a lot more autonomy than a typical principal agent of employer-employee relationship, which is why we are taking some sort of assumptions here for this model to work in principal agent framework. But I completely buy a point that if I were to now look at it as two independent agents playing a game, then the insights might change. But then I completely get your point about principal agents.
Yeah, I understand the description, but my question was more about is that an appropriate assumption? Because we typically, you would believe you as a consumer, you seek to maximize utility. So that's the standard kind of framework. I'm not saying that it must be used in all the cases, but the idea to frame this as a principal agency kind of problem is, I don't get that point.
No, that's again. So the reason we frame this as the principal agent in this case is because there is adverse selection and moral hazard at play. Which is, if I were to give attention to a news organization for my news, I'm not really sure who I'm engaging with, aka adverse selection. And I'm not really sure what efforts they're putting to give me quality content, aka moral hazard issues. So if I consider these two in tandem, then one of the ways I can model this is using principal agent framework. Now, if I were to model it in some other way, of course, I can do that, but it's not the case that this is the only theory I can use to model these. But these two sort of driving forces of the relationship between the public and the news organization allows us to model this as principal agent. I hope I answered your question.
We can talk offline.
Sure.
Thank you very much.